The tavern had been a meeting place once, a hidden gem for outlaws and dreamers alike, tucked on the fringes of a city still finding its rhythm. Now it was a forgotten relic, boarded up and left to crumble, just a stone's throw from the industrial heart of St. Louis. The cobblestone streets that surrounded it had long lost their charm, traded for cracked asphalt and the hum of distant freight trains. In those days, the neighborhood was alive, pulsing with stories and secrets. I'd cut my teeth there, first as a beat cop, then as a detective, chasing shadows in alleys that always seemed a little too dark. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was real, raw. I carried the memories with me, even as time pushed me toward something more modern, something colder when I saw the two-story brick building for the first time. Its faded grandeur whispered of a past as vibrant as my old haunt, but its present spoke a different language. Reinvention. The two-story brick structure had once been a lavish country estate for a wealthy family. Now it sat just north of downtown, St. Louis, in a neighborhood that had lost its charm long ago, but was gradually turning into a polished business district. The old mansion had been converted for modern use. The ground floor housed 4 office suites, while the second floor contained 2 large, upscale apartments. A wide corridor stretched from the imposing double doors with offices lining both sides. My office was the first on the left, marked by a solid wooden door with a frosted glass panel. In gold letters it read Matthew Steele Investigations Security Specialist. That's me, Matt Steele. Opinions about me vary. Some call me a legend. Others would say I'm a cautionary tale. I used to be a detective, but now I run my own pie business. I hunt down the truth, deal out justice, and let's face it, cash checks. To be honest, money wasn't a necessity. The settlement I got from the city ensured that, but sitting around doing nothing wasn't for me. I used to be one of the top detectives in the force until the day my world imploded. Catching my wife, Johanna, in bed with my boss, Captain Joe. Harper set off a chain reaction. Harper went for his tool. I took it away and gave him the beating of his life. That little episode cost me my badge, but got me a divorce and a financial settlement big enough to keep things quiet. With no one to answer to anymore, I became my own boss. I leaned back in my new chair, resting my feet on the desk, and let the city's buzz filter through the open window. I'd been living in one of the upstairs apartments for a while, though I still owned the house I'd gotten in the divorce. These days, it was just a rental property, bringing in some extra cash. The view here was worlds apart from my old office. Professionals walked by, dressed to impress, the sound of their footsteps crisp against the pavement. It was a far cry from the gritty, decaying neighborhood I'd worked in before. That building had been so sketchy, even I hesitated to stay late. When the city condemned it, I had no choice but to pack up. 2 weeks later, they tore it down. I smirked to myself. No complaints. Better neighborhood, less risk of getting mugged. The move wasn't entirely my idea. Abby, my girlfriend, had been pushing me to find a safer spot. So had Major Taylor, my former commander. Good offices attract good business, he told me. He wasn't wrong. Once I was Detective First Class Matt Steele. Now I am Matt Steele, private, investigator and head of my one-man operation. The settlement meant I could pick and choose my cases, and I liked it that way. Smart move, Steele, I muttered. The shadow of someone standing outside my office door caught my attention. A sharp knock followed, and then the door opened to reveal a tall man dressed in a perfectly tailored suit. "Mr. Steele?" he asked, his voice clipped and formal. I nodded. "I'm Jonathan Caldwell Robinson," he announced. I leaned forward, giving him a once-over. "I know who you are. You've been all over the news. Robinson was a prominent name in St. Louis, wealthy, influential, and a fixture in high society. His reputation as a philanthropist was well known, though many whispered it was more about control than charity. He was about my height, 6'3", but there the resemblance ended. His silver blonde Hair, steely blue eyes, and expensive suits screamed privilege. I disliked him on sight. I didn't bother with small talk. What do you need? His lips tightened at my tone. It's Mr. Robinson, he corrected, annoyed. And I need your help. He waited for me to show interest. I didn't. My wife, Cynthia, is having an affair, he continued, his tone icy. I need evidence for a divorce. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed. You're rich, Robinson. Might be cheaper to stay married. He didn't flinch. A scandal would be worse. We have a prenuptial agreement. If I prove infidelity, she walks away with nothing. I sighed. Domestic cases weren't my thing. They were messy, and no one came out unscathed. I'm not taking the case, I said flatly. His eyes narrowed. I'll make it worth your while. Still not interested. His gaze swept over the room, his disdain evident. You look like you could use the money, not yours. He exhaled sharply, clearly unused to being turned down. I'll pay you $10,000. That got my attention. I raised an eyebrow. Why me? Plenty of investigators charge less. He adjusted his cufflinks. Jason Worth and Hunter Blaine both recommended you. That was saying something. Both Worth and Blaine were top-notch PIs. If they thought I was the right fit, there had to be a good reason. And 10 grand for a few days of work. Hard to turn down. Fine, I said. 2 weeks tops. I find proof. I get the full 10. If not, I keep 5 up front. Without hesitation, Robinson pulled out a checkbook, wrote the amount, and slid it across the desk. You'll get results. I glanced at the check before picking it up. I'll need details, her routine, social circle, habits, and a recent photo. He handed me a manila envelope. It's all in here. When can you start? He asked. I tucked the envelope under my arm. Already did. He paused at the door, his face unreadable. I expect updates. You'll hear from me when there's something worth reporting, I replied, holding up the check. That's my policy. Take it or leave it. He stiffened. Why so difficult? I met his glare without flinching. Because I hate these kinds of cases. They never end well, but I'll get the job done on my terms. Fair enough, he said before leaving. Arrogant. Prick, I muttered, though I couldn't argue with the size of the check. Later, Abby strolled in after work, setting her bag down by the door. How's the new office? She asked. I didn't answer, pulling her into a kiss instead. She smiled. That good? I shrugged. Landed a case. Her smile faded. You don't look happy about it. It's a divorce gig. Catching a cheating spouse. She sighed. You always hate those. Yeah, feels like spying. Never ends well. She placed a hand on my chest. You just collect the facts. True, I admitted, but I've seen too many lives crumble because of what I find. Her eyes searched mine. This isn't about us, is it? I smirked. Of course not. Better not be. I chuckled. The guy offered enough money to convince me. Her eyebrow arched. 2 weeks tops. 5 grand up front, 10 if I deliver. I held up the check. Taking her hand, I led her toward the door. Let's celebrate with dinner. Then we'll come home and test that happily ever after. Theory. It was 10:30 a.m. and the weather was perfect. I sat in my truck watching the entrance of an upscale boutique. Cynthia Robinson had been inside for an hour. She's in no hurry, I muttered to a squirrel perched on a nearby tree. Warm air drifted through the open windows. People think pie work is thrilling. Most of it is waiting, watching, more waiting. 2 days of tailing Mrs. Robinson and I had nothing. No secret meetings, no hand-holding. Even her tennis coach had tried flirting. She ignored him. The squirrel chattered at me. Watch it or you're going in a stew pot, I grumbled. Cynthia finally stepped out. Early 30s, tall, blonde, blue-eyed. The kind of woman who was probably prom queen. What annoyed me? She spent 90 minutes inside and left, empty-handed. She didn't head to another boutique or a spa. Instead, she drove across town to a small coffee shop on the south side, nowhere near her Lindell Bluvd home. She parked, locked up, and practically skipped inside. I sighed. Guess I'll have to go in. I had a habit of talking to myself during stakeouts. Sometimes it was the most intelligent conversation I'd have all day. I pulled on a Cardinal sweatshirt, tugged a Rams cap low over my forehead, and threw on oversized sunglasses before stepping out of my truck and into the cafe. The barista was busy, giving me time to scan the place. Cynthia sat across from a man, both holding oversized coffee cups. She looked tense, speaking in a low voice. He smiled, took her hand, and said something that made her relax. Mid-40s fit, wavy brown hair combed back, well-dressed, but not Robinson's level of tailored. Wealth. The barista turned to me. Can I get you something? Coffee, I said. We have lattes, mochas. Black, I cut in. Just coffee. She smirked like I was a caveman who hadn't evolved past drip coffee. I paid for my oversized cup and took a window seat close enough to watch Cynthia and her mystery man. An hour passed. My coffee went cold and they finally stood. Helene in for a kiss. But she pulled away, not ready to cross that line, at least not in public. She left, climbed into her Mercedes, calling that thing a car felt wrong, and drove off. On my way out, I stopped at the counter and nodded toward the man in the corner. That guy looks familiar, I said. Who is he? The barista glanced over. George Hamilton, she replied. She's been here with him a few times, like the actor. She frowned. Who? Never mind. They've been coming in 2 or 3 times a week lately, she added. That afternoon, I let Google do the legwork. Hamilton was involved in one of Cynthia's charities. More interestingly, he and Robinson had clashed several times over the years. Looked like Hamilton was using Cynthia to get under Robinson's skin. For the next 11 days, I followed her. They met often. Coffee, lunch, dinner, always somewhere discreet. I took plenty of pictures. One night, I even managed to record their conversation from the next booth. Ain't technology great? I muttered after my last night of surveillance. She hadn't slept with him. Not yet. It seemed inevitable, but she was holding back. I typed up my report and printed it. The next morning, I met Robinson. At 10 a.m., I walked into his office at 1 Metropolitan Square, the most prestigious address in downtown St. Louis. His secretary barely glanced up. Mr. Steele. I nodded. She gestured toward an imposing wooden door. Go right in. Robinson's office boasted floor-to-ceiling windows with a commanding view of the Mississippi River and the Gateway Arch, the kind of skyline that made rich men feel untouchable. He didn't bother with pleasantries. You have what I need? He was already reaching for his checkbook. I slid a folder across the desk. You might not like what I found. He flipped through the photos while I spoke. That's George Hamilton. He and your wife have met several times. Coffee, lunch, dinner. But as far as I can tell, nothing physical has happened. I pointed to the last set of images. Cynthia and Hamilton exchanging cheek kisses, shaking hands. Looks more like an emotional affair than a physical one. Robinson's frown deepened. Hamilton is persuasive. Are you sure? I tailed your wife from morning to night. Unless he's sneaking into your bedroom, they haven't crossed that line. He sat back, muttering something under his breath. I let the silence stretch for a beat, then said I have a recording that might explain why. I played the audio. Cynthia's voice was quiet, laced with sadness. She admitted to Hamilton she felt ignored, like Robinson had married her for status, not love. She wasn't happy, but she wasn't ready to cheat. Hamilton, of course, tried to nudge her in that direction. I leaned back. I'm no marriage expert, but if you actually talk to your wife, maybe you could fix this. Robinson studied the photos, lost in thought. No need to write another check, I said. I didn't get what you wanted. Without hesitation, Robinson handed me a fresh $5,000 check. "You've given me plenty to think about," he said. His expression wasn't anger. It was something else. Determination. I studied him for a moment. A word of advice? He looked up, waiting. "Don't do anything stupid where Hamilton is concerned. Be a damn shame if you ended up in jail over a guy like that. Karma has a way of handling things." A tight smile flickered across his face. "I have no intention of going to jail, Mr. Steele," he said evenly. "Of that you can be sure." Sunday morning, a newspaper headline caught my eye. "Fatal boating accident on Alton Lake." One name in the article stopped me. Abby walked in and caught me, staring at the newspaper. "What's got you so interested?" I didn't look up. "A guy I knew died on Alton Lake." Her brow furrowed. "Who?" "George Hamilton." She frowned. "That name sounds familiar." I glanced at her. "He's the one who was trying to charm Cynthia Robinson." Her expression darkened. "What happened?" "Boat explosion," I said, tapping the headline. "They're calling it a gas leak." "There are accidents on the lake every summer," Abby said. "Nothing unusual." I stared at the article. Just weird. Never heard of the guy before the Robinson case, and now he's popped up twice. A few weeks later, Abby reminded me about a charity fundraiser she wanted me to attend. "Fine," I said, "but I'm not wearing a tux, and you owe me for this." She smirked, wrapped her arms around me, and kissed me breathless. "Consider that a down payment," she whispered. That Saturday, we walked into the Four Seasons Ballroom, one of St. Louis's most luxurious venues. Massive chandeliers, pristine table settings, and open bar. No expense spared. "They'd better be free with what these tickets cost," I muttered. The band played near the dance floor. "You could fit a half-court basketball game on that thing," I said. We found our seats with her colleagues. As I grabbed drinks, I spotted a familiar face. I nudged Abby. "The Robinsons are here, sitting with the mayor." It had been 6 weeks since I handed Jonathan Robinson my report. "Your old client?" she asked. I nodded. Dinner was underwhelming. Fancy plating, mediocre taste. We mingled afterward, making small talk I'd forget by morning. Plenty of men looked like they'd rather be at a sports bar. Eventually, we ended up near the VIP table. "I didn't expect to see you here, Steele," Robinson said. $1,000 a plate isn't your usual scene." I smirked. "Had some extra cash from a job a couple months ago. Figured I'd spend it on charity." His face darkened before he forced a neutral expression. "Cynthia, this is a business associate," he said, deliberately not naming me. I bowed slightly. "Mrs. Robinson, I'm Matt Steele, and this is my friend Abigail Stewart." Cynthia shook Abby's hand, then mine. "Have we met before?" she asked, studying me. Robinson tensed. I let him off the hook. "I don't believe so." I nodded at them both. "Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Robinson." "Good to see you again, John." Robinson's jaw clenched at the deliberate use of his first name. He'd taken a dig at me, so I returned the favor. As we walked away, I murmured, "Looks like they patched things up." "Not a chance," Abby said. "She's miserable." She nodded toward them. "Watch." The band started playing. Robinson reached for Cynthia's hand to lead her onto the dance floor, but she pulled away, brushing past him toward the ladies' room. "See?" Abby said. "Not my problem." I took her hand. "Didn't you mention something about further payment?" "Dance first, or skip to the good part?" She smiled, pulled me toward the exit, and made the choice for me. Sunday morning, I sat in my office, sipping coffee and skimming the police blotter. Old habits die hard. A short entry made me sit up. Cynthia Robinson was found dead late Saturday night, slumped in the passenger seat of her car under the Eads Bridge. What the hell was Cynthia doing there? I muttered. I called Frank Wins, a detective I used to work with. A groggy voice answered. "Why the hell are you calling me on a Sunday?" "I saw a blotter report on Cynthia Robinson," I said. "Know anything?" That woke him up. The Cynthia Robinson. This is the first I'm hearing of it. Let me know when you do, I said. He sighed heavily. You know, I can't discuss active cases. Silence stretched between us before his tone softened, curiosity creeping in. Then again, you're not exactly a civilian. What's your interest? Something feels off, I replied. Another sigh. Fine, I'll check it out, but don't call me at home again. The line went dead before I could reply. I stared out the window, lost in thought. Abby walked in, refilled my cup, and perched on my lap. You look deep in thought, she said. I handed Abby the newspaper. First, George Hamilton dies in a boating accident. Now Cynthia's dead. That's not a coincidence. She barely glanced at the article. People die all the time. Sure, but these two were connected, I said, my tone firm. She folded her arms, giving me a skeptical look. If it's bothering you, call Frank. I already did. I said the report says it was a carjacking gone bad. Abby raised an eyebrow. That happens. Maybe, I admitted, but Cynthia wouldn't be under the Eads Bridge unless something was up. She sighed, rubbing her temple. What can you do that? The cops can't. Before I could answer, she waved a dismissive hand. Never mind, I smirked. Cops have rules. I don't. At 7 a.m., my phone rang, dragging me out of sleep. I groaned, fumbling for it. This better be important. Frank chuckled on. The other end. Payback for yesterday. Want the full report? I sighed, sitting up. Go ahead. Cynthia was found half in, half out of her car, Frank said, kicking badly. Looks like she tried to get back inside, maybe reaching for her phone. Small. Caliber bullet to the base of her skull. Probably a .22. I frowned. The report said carjacking. That's what it says, Frank replied. I let the silence stretch before speaking. Something's off. Frank's tone turned dry. Oh, great, detective. Enlighten me. If it was a mugging, I said, why was her purse still there? A carjacker wouldn't have left the car. And why was she on the passenger side? The line went quiet. This wasn't a robbery, I said. This was a liquidation. Frank exhaled. I need to talk to the detectives. I'll be in touch. The call cut off, and I immediately dialed Ricky Willard, a cybercrime specialist at the precinct. Still doing side work? I asked when he picked up. Legal side work? Sure, Ricky replied, a hint of humor in his tone. Meet me at the Flying Saucer for lunch. My treat. After a shower and shave, I dressed in brown slacks, a blue pinstriped shirt, and a tan cashmere blazer. When I pulled into the Flying Saucer, I spotted Ricky's beat-up Chevy parked in the lot. Inside, he was already halfway through a burger, washing it down with a dark beer. He smirked as I slid into the booth across from him. Big boss is in town, he said. Wants us to pretend we're busy. I waved off his offer of a drink. I need info on Jonathan and Cynthia Robinson. Ricky raised an eyebrow. Legally, of course. Of course, I said with a small grin. There have been 2 passings tied to Robinson, he said, leaning back. His wife and her almost love her. I'll dig into it. See if anything stands out. Ricky wiped his mouth with a napkin. I'm keeping this clean, I added. He chuckled. Relax. I owe you one. Years ago, I stepped in when a bar fight nearly got Ricky stabbed. He hadn't forgotten. He stood and grabbed his jacket. I'll call you by noon tomorrow. Thanks. I'll send a check. He waved a hand. Lunch covers it. At 2, I rode the elevator up to Robinson's office. His secretary nodded. One moment, Mr. Steele. Smart woman. Remembered me after one meeting. Inside, Robinson sat at his oversized desk, pretending to be busy. Why are you here? His tone was cold. I slouched into a chair. Sorry for your loss, both Cynthia and Hamilton. Robinson sneered. Hamilton was no friend of mine. Funny you mentioned him first. His expression hardened. Of course. I'm devastated about my wife. Looks like you're managing just fine. He shifted. I think you had something to do with both passings, I said. His face darkened. I stood. I'm looking into it. If I'm right, you're screwed. Robinson shot to his feet, his voice low and furious. You can't prove anything, and I'll make your life hell if you try. I smirked. Gumshoe, nobody's used that since the Maltese Falcon. You're outdated, Jonathan. I turned to leave, trying to slam the door, only to be foiled by a slow close mechanism. Not as dramatic as I'd hoped. The next morning, I sat at my desk, coffee in hand, watching the women from the neighboring offices stroll by my version of a morning stakeout. The quiet was shattered by my phone ringing. I answered quickly. Matt Steele, it's Ricky, he said without preamble. Got something on the Robinsons. He didn't wait for me to respond. Turns out Robinson wasn't the rich one. Cynthia was. She owned the company where they met. I sat up straighter. You sure? Positive, Ricky confirmed. They tried counseling, but it didn't work. She was about to divorce him. And the prenup? I asked. He'd walk away with nothing, even his car. Hers. I exhaled slowly. And now he gets everything. Exactly, Ricky said. I leaned back in my chair, nearly tipping it over. Looks like I was right. That night at dinner, Abby caught me zoning out, staring. At my plate? You've got that case-solving look, she said, raising an eyebrow. I smiled, faintly. You know me too well. So what's the case? She asked. This one's for me, I said, leaning back. No client. She raised an eyebrow. No client. I set down my fork. I'm going to prove Jonathan Robinson had his wife eliminated. Probably had. George Hamilton taken out too. Abby frowned. Why him? I leaned in slightly. You saw Cynthia at the fundraiser. She wasn't happy. She nodded. Wouldn't dance with him. Pulled away when he touched her. Exactly. I didn't see it then, but now the dots connect. I signaled for the check. Let's get out of here. I drove Abby home, taking my time. She had an early flight and would be gone for 2 days. The next morning, I finalized 2 real estate deals, sold my divorce house for a profit, and bought a historic home in Compton Heights. A surprise for Abby. As I headed back to my truck, my phone rang. Matt Steele, I answered. Steele. It's Ricky, came the voice on the other end. Yeah, I prompted. You owe me one. Time to collect, Ricky said. What's up? I asked, bracing myself. The woman who got us the Robinson info, Stella Reyes, is in trouble, Ricky explained. I frowned, concerned. She get caught leaking? No, Ricky replied grimly. Worse, her mom's sick and she borrowed from a loan shark. The interest is crushing her, and now he's making threats. How bad is it? I pressed. She borrowed $4,000, Ricky said. And he's charging 2% a day, over $500 a week. If she's late, he adds, more. I let out a low whistle. Who's the shark? Tom Ledoux, Tommy the Turtle, Ricky told me. I knew Tommy. I'd busted him a couple of times back when I was a cop, but he always managed to slip away. Find out how much she's paid so far and where she meets him, I instructed. An hour later, Ricky called me back. She meets him at Dee's place in Soulard, he reported. She's been paying $200 a week for 2 months, but she still owes $3,800. He told her if she stops paying, her mom gets hurt. Got it, I said. I'll handle it. With Abby out of town, I figured I'd grab a burger at Dee's. Soulard was booming. Young professionals restoring old homes, businesses thriving. Dee's, once a dive, was now a sports bar. I walked into the bar at 7 p.m. and spotted Tommy right away, lounging in a booth. He wore a silk shirt, gold chains, and cream-colored linen pants, a flashy ensemble that screamed overconfidence. I couldn't resist. Linen pants, Tommy in St. Louis. Beside him sat Jimmy Sarge Rice, his muscle. The guy was a towering 66 and built like a tank, all 350 LEBs of him radiating pure intimidation. I stepped up to their table, letting my smirk do the talking before I even opened my mouth. "Tommy," I greeted, the smirk turning into a jab. "Still robbing old ladies?" Tommy's expression darkened. "What do you want, Steele?" "You ain't a cop no more." "That," I said, leaning in slightly, "is your first mistake." "Oh, yeah," he shot back, narrowing his eyes. "And the second thinking you can brush me off," I replied, my voice low and steady. Tommy flicked, his fingers at Jimmy. "Get rid of him." Jimmy unfolded himself from the booth. I casually flipped back my coat, revealing my Glock. Resting my hand on the grip, I said, "No need to get up." Jimmy hesitated, eyeing Tommy, then reluctantly sat back down. Tommy smirked, clearly enjoying himself. "You said I made 2 mistakes. What's the other one?" "Stella Reyes," I said, leaning forward slightly. "She borrowed $4,000 and has been paying you weekly, but the principal barely budged. That ridiculous Vig. That's your second mistake." Tommy opened his mouth to argue, but I raised a hand, cutting him off. "She'll pay what she owes, no more. No less, no interest. You've already made $4,000 in profit, Tommy." "That's enough," Tommy sneered. "You don't tell me how to run my business, Steele." "You're right, I don't," I said with a cold smile, "because I don't need proof or rules." I let that sink in before adding, "Here's your one warning. Let Stella go." Tommy's eyes flicked to the Glock at my side. "You gonna shoot me?" he asked, a mix of bravado and doubt. I winked. "Think about it." He exhaled sharply, deflating like a balloon. "Fine. No more Vig, but she better pay up." Satisfied, I pulled a card from my pocket and tossed it onto the table. "If there's a problem, call me. Don't send your goons. Don't break anything. Got it?" Tommy glared but didn't reply. I turned toward the door. "Nice doing business with you, Tommy." On the drive home, I made a call. "Jake there?" I asked when someone picked up. A few seconds later, Jake's voice came on the line. "Steele." "What's up?" "Meet me at Molly's," I said. Molly's was a hole in the wall where business stayed off the books. Jake the Snake Stedman was a pro-informant, con man, and thief. If anything shady happened in St. Louis, he knew about it. I walked in, let my pistol flash accidentally, and slid into a booth. "I need to know if Cynthia Robinson's passing was random or a contract liquidation." Jake shrugged. "I'll see what I can dig up. You'll find something. You always do." I stood, leaving my card. "Call me." The next night, my phone buzzed. I picked up. "Steele." "It's Jake," he said, his voice low. "Got something for you?" "That was fast," I replied, surprised. Jake let out a dry chuckle. "The sooner I put distance between us, the better." "What did you find?" I asked, cutting to the chase. "A guy named Wiley Thornton and his crew took out Hamilton and Robinson," Jake said. "Thornton was bragging in a bar, trying to impress some guy connected to Vito Ciclari." I clenched my jaw, so he was showing off. "Yeah," Jake confirmed. "Said he got $100,000 for both jobs." "How many in his crew?" "I pressed 2, Jake said. "But Thornton's the one to watch." He hesitated, then added, "Look, I don't like you, but you've always been straight with me, so I'll warn you. Thornton's bad news." "Noted," I said evenly. "If your info checks out, we're even." "Good," Jake said with a touch of relief. "I always get in trouble around you, Steele." I hung up. I had a name. On the way home, I shifted gears, thinking about the house I'd bought for Abby. She was back from her trip, so I took her for a tour of Compton Heights as we drove past a massive, white stone house. I slowed down. "That one's nice, huh?" Abby nodded, admiring the carved mahogany doors. "Let's check it out." I pulled into the driveway. She frowned. "Matt, we can't just—" I grinned. "The owner won't mind." I helped her out of the car, then let her in on the surprise. "I bought this house for us." Her mouth dropped open. 6 bedrooms, 4 baths, just under 6,000 square feet. Needs work, but we can fix it up while staying at my place. I watched her take it all in. That is, if you like it. If not, we'll fix it up and sell it. She threw her arms around me. Don't even think about selling our house. Let's go inside. That afternoon, I gave Abby a full tour of the house. She gave me one too, pointing out everything that needed fixing. We stayed until sunset, taking in the potential of the place. By the next morning, I had the utilities turned on. Electricity and running water made it feel like more than just an empty shell. Now it's home, Abby said, curling up beside me on the porch. Over the next few weeks, we found a contractor, a father and son duo who understood our vision for the house. My main role? Writing the checks. I only had one specific request. The den is my sanctuary, I told Abby. She rolled her eyes but didn't argue. One evening, as I grabbed my jacket to head out, Abby watched me closely. Your friend's in low. Places find something? She asked, her tone both teasing and cautious. Yeah, I said, trying to sound casual. But I need to confirm a few things. I didn't mention that I was tracking a hitman. Abby worried too much as it was back by one, I added as I opened the door. Don't wait up. I kissed her, grabbed my truck keys, and left. Some places weren't safe for a Cadillac, let alone my Corvette. If Wiley Thornton was the guy, I'd know soon enough. And if he was, he had no idea what was coming. Just past midnight, I left a dive bar on Lindell Bellevue and headed for my truck. As I reached for the door, movement in the window's reflection caught my eye. A car pulled up behind me. A man stepped out. I turned sharply. He stopped 20 feet away. Average height, average build, dark hair. Hard to tell under the streetlights. Dark jeans, sleeveless sweatshirt. The only standout, the revolver at his side. A second guy climbed out, standing beside him. Get in the car, the man ordered, motioning with the weapon. I pulled back my jacket, letting my Glock show. Come on, man, the second guy said. Jasper will shoot you. You don't care. Shut up, Boyd, Jasper snapped. Get in the car, Steele. Our boss wants to see you. Well, now we know each other's names. Makes it easier to talk, I said, smirking. Jasper frowned. My calmness unsettled him. He glanced at Boyd. That second of hesitation was all I needed. I rested my hand on my tool. Boyd yanked his own. Who's your boss? I asked. You'll find out soon enough, Jasper said. Get in, or we'll pay a visit to that witch you run around with. Wrong move. Jasper started raising his tool, but stopped when he saw my grip tighten. That's a 38, right? You might get one shot off, maybe even hit me. But this I tap my Glock is a 45 with a hair trigger. Before you pull twice, I'll have two in you and maybe one in Boyd. So tell me, do you feel lucky? They apparently did. Both raised their weapons. Jasper fired first. He missed. He never got a second shot. Boyd didn't fire at all. 2 quick shots. Double tap. Just like Tully taught me. Took Jasper down. A third put Boyd on the ground. Not dead, but wishing they were. I kicked their tools away, pulled out my phone and held it where they could see. You boys look rough. Want me to call an ambulance? Jasper groaned. Come on, Steele, I'm bleeding out. Tell me who sent you and I'll make the call. Silence. Nearest hospital is 10 blocks in, I said, stepping toward my truck. I don't think you'll make it. Wiley Thornton. Jasper gasped. Bingo. He told us to make you stop asking about Hamilton and Robinson. His boss told him to shut you down. I heard Wiley call him Robinson. Gotcha. I called emergency, reported the shooting, then dialed. Frank wins. You really love waking me up, he grumbled. 2 guys just tried to abduct me. I already called emergency. Frank was instantly awake. On my way. Don't say a word till I get there. Patrol cars arrive fast. I set my Glock on my truck's hood. No way I was getting shot by a rookie. EMTs rolled. In next. Jasper and Boyd were stabilized and loaded into ambulances. Frank pulled up a few minutes later, concern written all over his face. You okay? He asked as he stepped out of the car. What happened? They invited me for a ride, I said, brushing dust off my jacket. I declined. They got pushy. I handled it. Who sent them? Frank pressed. I hesitated, glancing away. Come on, Matt. I know you, Frank said, crossing his arms. You squeezed it out of them. I didn't respond, keeping my expression neutral. Matt, he said, lowering his voice. Once they hit the hospital, they'll clam up. Give me something. Not yet, I said firmly. If I tell you now, you'll have to investigate, and that'll tip him off. Let me make it stick. Frank didn't look happy, but gave a reluctant nod. Another unmarked car pulled up moments later, and out stepped Captain Joe Harper. Perfect. The man who wrecked my marriage and cost me my badge. Well, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Look who drew the short straw. Harper's expression darkened. Guess you're not as high up as you thought, I continued. Midnight calls. That's got a sting. He ignored me, turning to speak with the officers on the scene. When he finally turned back to me, his tone was icy. What did you do, Steele? I told the patrolman, I replied. Told Detective Wins, not saying another word without my lawyer. Harper smirked, his eyes narrowing. You still hate me, don't you? I let out a sharp laugh. Hate you. Haven't thought about you in 5 years, Joe. You're not that important. You. Put 2 guys in the hospital, he said, his voice rising. Could have been body bags, I shot back. Harper's face turned a shade of crimson. You're not walking away from this unless you're arresting me, I said, stepping toward my truck. I'm going home. As I climbed into the cab, something caught my eye. A fresh bullet hole in the frame. Guess Jasper wasn't as bad a shot as I thought, I muttered under my breath. When I got home, Abby was asleep on the couch. She must have been, waiting up. I kicked off my boots, lay down behind her, and pulled her close. She stirred, her voice groggy. I fell asleep. Sorry. Want coffee? Want to tell me what happened in the morning? I murmured, holding her tighter. Go to sleep. Love you, she whispered, her voice fading. Love you too, I replied softly. By morning, Abby caught me zoning out over breakfast. All right, Matt. What's going on? I sighed. I need you to do something. You won't like it, but I need you to do it anyway. She studied me. Okay, no arguments. What is it? I frowned. Just like that. Just like that, she said, taking my hand. I trust you, so tell me. 2 men pulled tools on me last night, tried to drag me into their car. When I refused, they threatened you. Her expression hardened. I assume they regretted that. They're in the hospital. I sipped my coffee, but their boss wanted them to say that. And he's serious. I want you to visit your parents for a while. Her folks lived in Eminence M.O. Quiet, safe. She opened her mouth to argue. You've got vacation time. Your dad would love to see you. You deserve a break. Mostly. I won't worry if you're with him. Seconds passed. Then she leaned across the table and kissed me. Let me get packed. An hour later, she tossed a suitcase into her car, gave me a wave, and headed out. Back at my office, I picked up the phone and called Frank. You ever get tired of waking me up, Matt? He grumbled as he answered. Giving you a break this time, I replied. Frank snorted. What do you got? Cynthia Robinson had all the money, I explained. She was divorcing Jonathan. If she'd gone through with it, he'd have been broke. Frank stayed quiet, processing. I started digging, I continued. A guy named Wiley Thornton was bragging about eliminating both Hamilton and Cynthia. Frank let out a sharp breath. Damn. And one of those guys who tried to grab me admitted it, I added. Let us handle it, Matt, Frank urged. You won't get to him. Like I will, I said firmly. I'm going to talk to Thornton, see if he admits who paid him. Matt, Frank warned. Don't do anything stupid, Thornton threatened Abby. Frank, I said, my voice hard. No one does that if things go smoothly. I'll call you in. And if they don't? Frank asked, his tone wary. Guess we'll find out, I said before hanging up. Frank sighed. The second you have something solid, you call me. I hung up. Abriana's Deli, sat on Shaw Ave. Near the Kings Highway overpass in the Hill, St. Louis's old-school Italian neighborhood. Two things set it apart. First, the food, best sandwiches in town, strongest coffee. Second, it doubled as Vito Ciclari's office. Vito ran the St. Louis mob, gambling, loan sharking, labor unions. He had a hand in all of it, but never pills. Pills are a plague, he once told me. People will always gamble, always get in over their heads. I just make sure they owe the right people. Despite being a crime boss, Vito looked after his neighborhood. He funded St. Ambrose Church, backed community projects, and made sure struggling families got help. If a man drank or gambled, his paycheck away, Vito had a conversation with him. The problem never happened again. I walked in. Vito sat in his usual spot, flanked by two guys built like dump trucks. Nearby, Rudy Cassidy lounged at another table. Unlike Vito's crew, Rudy wasn't Italian, but he was trusted, deadly, and always watching. We had crossed paths before, not as enemies, just professionals on opposite sides. I gave a nod to the doorman and approached Vito Ciclari's table. Mr. Ciclari, I said evenly, I'd like a word. Vito gestured to the seat across from him, a faint smirk playing on his lips. Last time I saw you, he said, you were trying to pin a gambling charge on me. What do you want, Steele? We never had enough, I admitted, taking the seat. You were too smart. Some cops would have planted evidence just to put me away, he said, his tone sharp. I don't play like that, I replied. If I wanted you gone, I wanted it to stick. His smirk faded slightly as I leaned in closer. I need to talk to someone at the Hard Case Tavern. Vito raised an eyebrow. Why come to me? Come on, Vito. Everyone knows you run the South Side, I said. The Hard Case. If you don't own it, you control it. His expression stayed carefully neutral. Who are you looking for? Wiley Thornton, I said. Nothing. No flicker of recognition. No reaction. He doesn't work for you, I continued, but he's been hanging around trying to get in, running his mouth to Sammy Hands, looking for an in. Vito sipped his espresso, taking his time before responding. Why do you care about Thornton? Someone hired me for a job, I said, keeping my voice low. That same someone hired Thornton to clean up loose ends. I want Thornton and I want his boss. A pause. Then Vito nodded. You always played straight with me, Steele, even when you were a cop. Go ahead and talk to him. I'll tell Sammy to stay out of it as long as you don't make a mess. I stood, nodded in thanks, and turned to leave before I could. Rudy cut me off. If you need backup, Steele, call me, he said with a grin. I don't like nobody's trying to take my job. I got this, Rudy. As I walked out to my truck, one thought lingered. I really wouldn't want Vito or Rudy mad at me. It was still early when I called Abby. When can I come home? She asked, her voice soft but tinged with worry. Give me 3 or 4 days, I replied. Then I'll come down and we'll spend a few days on the river. Maybe do some fishing, or you could just come now and let the police handle it, she suggested. Frank doesn't have enough to move yet, I explained. And those 2 guys who jumped me won't talk. But if they were charged, I'll call Frank and tell him most of what I know, I assured her. If he can act on it, I'll follow his lead. She sighed. Promise me you'll be careful. I promise, I said, my tone firm. For the rest of the call, we talked about the trip. It was a good distraction for both of us. At 9 a.m., I called Frank. You again? He groaned as he picked up. I need to talk to Jasper, I said without preamble. The guy who tried to abduct you? Frank asked, his disbelief clear. Yeah, they lawyered up, he said, not talking. Let me try, I insisted. Why? He asked, skeptical. Trust me, Frank, I said. I'll get you a case on a double homicide. Silence. Then tomorrow, 9 a.m. holdover cells. And Matt, be damn sure the boss doesn't like you going rogue. St. Alexius Hospital prison ward. Jasper glared at me from his hospital bed. Why should we help you? Shut up, Boyd, Jasper muttered, shooting his cellmate a sharp look. Then he turned back to me. Seriously, Steele? Why? You're looking at serious time, I said evenly. You think Wiley Thornton's going to help you when things get tough? Jasper scowled, his jaw tightening. I can't get your charges dropped, I continued, but I can get you protection. Jasper stiffened slightly, a flicker of interest breaking through his defiance. You know Vito Ciclari? I asked. Yeah, that got his attention. He didn't respond, but the shift in his posture told me he was listening. Vito doesn't like Thornton stepping into his territory, I explained. Help me put Thornton away, and I'll make sure Vito spreads the word that you're under his protection. Before Jasper could reply, Boyd jumped in. That's good enough for me. Jasper hesitated, his eyes darting to Boyd and then back to me. All I need is for you to tell the DA the truth, I said. No lies, no embellishments. Just what Thornton said about Robinson ordering the liquidation. Jasper let out a long exhale, weighing his options. Finally, he gave a small nod. All right, Steele, he said. We'll talk. I turned to the door. Frank. Frank stepped in. They're ready to cooperate, I said. Tell the DA. Let's make this stick. Frank pulled out his phone as I stepped outside. I took a deep breath, letting everything sink in. As I climbed into my truck, Frank waved me down. Jasper and Boyd gave up Wiley Thornton, he said. Claimed he ordered the hijacking and took out Cynthia Robinson. They even tied him to Hamilton's passing. He squinted at me. How'd you get them? To crack? Told them Rudy Cassidy was pissed, and that Vito Ciclari would put them under his protection inside, I said. Frank exhaled, processing that. You think Vito will? Not for them, I replied. But for Rudy? Yeah. Vito doesn't want his guy caught up in a mess over Thornton, and he sure as hell doesn't like Thornton throwing his name around. Frank sighed heavily. You know I have to arrest Thornton, and you can't be involved. I get it, I said. But you can't just walk into the hard case and grab him. He'll see you coming. I can't. Frank tilted his head. So you go in first and we wait outside. I nodded. Why face him yourself? He asked, frowning. Because Thornton can give up the real target. Jonathan Robinson, I said firmly. Frank crossed his arms. Matt, the case against Thornton is thin. A good lawyer will argue hearsay. We might not get a conviction. Maybe, I admitted, but maybe I can make him believe we have enough to put him on passing row. Frank exhaled sharply, looking reluctant. I'll call you when I have him, I said. The Hard. Case Tavern, 8 p.m., a rifle bar narrow, 30 feet wide, stretching 70 feet back. Small tables lined one side. A bar ran the full length of the other. Bigger tables filled the back. I had called Frank first. He and 3 patrolmen waited outside. Inside, Wiley Thornton sat at the bar, trying to impress Sammy Hands, the manager. I walked up. Let me buy you a drink, Wiley. He turned, puffing up. Do I know you? Not yet, but you will. The bartender set his drink down. I reached over, dumped the ice and liquor, and slid the empty glass into a plastic evidence bag. I handed it to Frank. He sighed, but signed the envelope. Sammy, watching, didn't say a word. Mr. Ciclari called. Said you'd be coming, he muttered, then disappeared into his office. I turned to Wiley. Not very smart, are you? Bragging about contract eliminates in a bar full of strangers. Talking ain't a crime, he sneered. Jasper and Boyd didn't think so, either, until they ended up in lockup. They rolled on you, told us all about Robinson and the jobs you did. So what? Their word against mine? He stood ready to leave. When I didn't move, he swung. A sloppy roundhouse meant to knock me down. Rookie mistake. I stepped in, drove a fist into his solar plexus, and let physics take over. Wiley froze, gasping. I slid my jacket aside, showing my Glock. "Hey, Wiley," I said calmly. "I hear you're crazy. Lucky for you, so am I. So how about you sit back down and have a nice chat?" His eyes flicked between my pistol and my face. He climbed back onto his stool. Frank let out a grunt, clearly not thrilled with me flashing my tool. "It's not just Jasper and Boyd's word," I continued. Wiley looked unconvinced. "We pulled prints from Hamilton's boat and Cynthia's car. No faults in the system yet." I gestured to the evidence bag. "I bet those prints match." His smirk disappeared. "Detective wins," I said. "Nodding toward Frank is here to keep things by the book." "You can't take my prints unless I'm arrested," Wiley scoffed. "Wrong," I said. "That glass. Public property now, and Jasper and Boyd naming you gives Frank enough to bring you in." Wiley shrugged. "Go ahead, take me in." Frank didn't hesitate. He snapped on the cuffs. "Wiley Thornton, you're wanted for questioning in the homicides of George Hamilton and Cynthia Robinson." As Frank read Wiley his rights, I leaned in close. "Here's the deal, Wiley," I said, keeping my voice low. "Your guy's flipped. Your prints are about to sink you. But if you tell us who paid you, maybe we can get the DA to drop the execution." Wiley swallowed hard. "What kind of deal?" "Testify against Robinson," I said. "You'll still do life, but at least you'll be breathing." He hesitated, his eyes darting between me and Frank, then leaned back in his chair. "I'll wait for my lawyer." Frank signaled for patrol officers to take Wiley away. As they let him out, Frank turned to me, his brow furrowed. "You realize the second Thornton talks to his lawyer, they'll ask for the fingerprint report," Frank said. "Yeah," I replied calmly. "We don't have a fingerprint report," he said, his tone sharp. "I know," I admitted. Frank frowned, clearly frustrated. "Matt, what the hell are you up to?" "Hold him for questioning," I said. "We've got 48 hours. I'll get what we need." Later, inside the interview room, Frank placed a recorder on the table. Suspect Wiley Thornton representing him. Public Defender Philip Stone, Detective Frank Wins, Present Consultant Matt Steele, Frank stated for the record. He turned to Wiley. "You're a suspect in 2 homicides. Anything you want to say?" Wiley smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Prove it." Frank's phone buzzed. He stood and switched off the recorder. "Excuse me?" he said before stepping out of the room. I leaned forward, my voice low and steady. "We've got you, Wiley. When the fingerprint results come back, they'll tie you to both homicide scenes." Wiley barely flinched, but I saw the shift. I glanced at his lawyer. "Unless, of course, you're innocent," Stone spoke up. "We expect all evidence to be disclosed." I shrugged. "Far as I know, since Wiley hasn't been charged, we don't have to share." "Anything yet?" Stone's eyes narrowed. "Then why is he in custody?" "Questioning," Frank said, re-entering the room with a tall, sharp-dressed woman. He restarted the recorder. "Wiley, if you cooperate, you might just win yourself a prize," I smirked. "Detective Wins. Tell our contestant what he could win," Frank gestured. "Assistant DA Geraldine Sawyer." Sawyer took a seat across from Wiley and his lawyer. "Give us a statement, your involvement and who hired you, and I'll speak to the DA about your charges." Frank leaned in. "You're done, Wiley." "The only question is how bad it'll be," Wiley and Stone whispered. Then Stone sighed. "Take the execution off the table and my client will talk." Sawyer nodded. "If he tells the truth, the DA won't seek passing." Wiley exhaled. Stone added, "And a life sentence with parole eligibility after 25 years. I met Sawyer's eyes. We had worked together before, and I knew she'd tighten the screws just enough. Frank tapped the table. Thornton Wiley exchanged a look with his lawyer and gave a slow nod. "All right. What do you want to know? Did you eliminate George Hamilton and Cynthia Robinson?" Sawyer asked, his tone sharp. Wiley hesitated before muttering. Yeah. Who hired you? Sawyer pressed. The broad's husband, Wiley began, but Sawyer's glare stopped him mid-sentence. I mean Robinson, Jonathan Robinson, Wiley corrected. Paid me 100 grand for the record, Sawyer said, his voice firm. Wiley shifted uncomfortably. Jonathan Robinson hired me. Did he say why? Sawyer asked. Wiley hesitated again, then shook his head. Just told me to take care of Hamilton first, then his wife. How? Sawyer asked, leaning forward. Wiley smirked, as if relishing the memory. Hamilton's boat had an air pump to clear gas fumes from the bilge. I disconnected it, scraped the insulation off the starter wires. He turned the key. Boom. Sawyer's jaw tightened. And Cynthia Robinson. She was coming out of some shop in Front Neck, Wiley said, his voice casual, hands full of bags. I knocked her down. Frank's voice cut in hard and cold. She was knocking badly. She didn't drop easy, Wiley said with a shrug. That pissed me off. Sawyer kept her voice level. Where did you shoot her? Back of the head. Silence. 22. I clenched my jaw. 2 innocent people were dead because I took Robinson's case in the first place. Sawyer looked at Frank and me. Anything else? We both shook our heads. She turned to Wiley. The DA will honor the deal because of your testimony. Wiley smirked, thinking he had won. Sawyer wasn't done. You'll serve your time in Jefferson City Correctional, Boonville to be precise. His smirk faded. I leaned in. Hope you like your new home, Wiley. I hear the guys there love fresh meat. Frank stood on your feet. Wiley was officially under arrest. Stone protested. You should have read his rights before questioning. Frank smirked. We did when we brought him in. You were here, remember? Now he's officially booked. A nearby officer led Wiley away. I exhaled. I wanted Wiley. But Robinson's the real target. Sawyer adjusted her bag. What we got here is solid. Stone will push back, but he'll take the deal. She nodded at us. Next time, call me for something easier. As she left, I shook my head. That woman's tough. She wants to be DA, Frank said. And I wouldn't bet against her. We walked to his car, illegally parked in a loading zone. You sure you can park here? I asked. Unloading a case for a butcher? He shot back. Who's dumb enough to ticket an unmarked car? I laughed. Traffic division. Isn't stupid. Could belong to a captain. They don't need that headache. When do we grab Robinson? I asked. Frank hesitated, then sighed. Well, partner, he said in a bad John Wayne impression. I reckon we could round him up right now. I grinned. Might as well ride with the posse. Then he dropped the accent. I want to arrest him in front of his employees. Let them see him dragged out in cuffs. I opened the passenger door. I like your style, cowboy. Let's go. Frank started the car, then shot me a pointed look. I called Ricky this morning, he said. He told me something interesting. I raised an eyebrow. What about? You, Frank muttered. You had Ricky pull Robinson's financials, didn't you? I hesitated, then shrugged. Maybe. Damn it, Matt, Frank snapped. Ricky works for the police, not your pie firm. Relax, I said with a smirk. He did it on his lunch break. Frank shook his head. You're reckless, you know that? Yeah. I waved him off. What did he find? Frank sighed. 2 large withdrawals, one after Hamilton's passing, one after Cynthia's 50 grand each. I exhaled. That's 100 grand, the exact amount Wiley was paid. Frank smirked with Wiley's confession. That locks Robinson down. I cracked my knuckles. Let's ruin his day. We pulled up to Robinson's office, a sleek glass and steel tower downtown. As we stepped inside, I spotted Robinson's assistant, the sharp, young woman who had remembered me from months ago. Mr. Steele, she greeted with a polite smile. Nice to see you again. Mr. Robinson is in a meeting. Would you like to wait? Frank flashed his badge. No, ma'am, I don't think we will. Frank led the way through the heavy wooden door into the office. The secretary reached for the phone, but I held up a finger and shook my head. She hesitated, then put it back down. Jonathan Robinson sat at a conference table near the massive floor-to-ceiling windows with 3 other men. A younger guy stood by a rolling cart, running a presentation on a large monitor, flipping through graphs and pie charts. How anyone could focus on a screen with that Mississippi River view was beyond me. Frank strode in, flashing his badge. Robinson stood, his irritation clear. "Jonathan Robinson, you're under arrest," Frank announced. Robinson's jaw clenched. "On what charge?" More annoyed than afraid. "Premeditated homicide, conspiracy, accessory before and after the fact. That's just for starters." Frank pulled out a laminated card and started reading his rights. Robinson made his move. The second Frank glanced at the card. Robinson bolted for the door. Too bad for him. I was in the way. I caught him with a sharp left to the jaw. He staggered back and dropped, landing hard, sliding across the polished floor until I stood over him. I grinned. "Told you I'd see you. Get what's coming, Jonathan." Frank rolled him onto his stomach and snapped the cuffs on. Add fleeing and obstruction to the list. He hauled Robinson up. I gave Frank an innocent look. "Did I get too involved?" Frank sighed. "Shut up. Let's get him. Booked." I ran my hand over the intricate woodwork. "I think we should refinish the wainscoting. Never understood why people paint over wood like this." Abby and I were deep in the renovation of the Compton Heights house, restoring its original beauty while updating the plumbing, wiring, and HVAC. The summer breeze rolled in through the massive windows, clearing the lingering paint fumes. Before she could answer, my phone rang, breaking the moment. "Matt Steele," I answered, already annoyed. "It's Frank." I straightened. "What's up?" "Just a heads up. The DA isn't cutting Robinson any deals. He's prosecuting personally," says Robinson's. "Going to pay in full." Frank chuckled. Election year after all. 3 months had passed since the arrest. "Good. Let me know when the trial starts. I want to see his face when he hears guilty." I hesitated. "You and the wife want to meet us at Ragazzi's tonight?" Abby raised an eyebrow as I hung up. "Robinson." I nodded. "Good. Now you can focus on our house." "Our house, huh?" I kept my expression. Unreadable. Abby eyed me, trying to figure out if I was joking. I walked over to my jacket, pulled out a thick stack of papers, and handed them to her. Her eyes flicked across the top page. Slowly, a smile formed. "That's the new deed," I told her. "Owners Matthew and Abigail Steele." Her mouth parted slightly. I shrugged. "Figured if it's legal, we should make it official." Her smile widened, still. "Processing." That's when I pulled out the ring and slid it onto her finger. "And by the way," I murmured, "I love you." She stared at the ring, turning her hand to catch the light, slid it up and down her finger, adjusting to the weight. Finally, with a teasing smirk, she said, "I've always wanted to own property.